I'm back. Not sure anyone else is. Doesn't sound like it. Okay.
This time we watched KTMA4, Gamera versus Barugon.
That sounds familiar. Didn't we do this already?
Yes, but it's Gamuary, and I guess Gamuary is a lot like Groundhog Day, where all of our days will be the same. We are essentially experiencing the same movie twice this month.
Yeah, but in very different formats. One is, in a lot of ways, when Joel, as host, was at his peak on the Comedy Central network, and the other one was from the very, very early beginnings of Mystery Science Theater 3000, when they were just a tiny little program on KTMA in East Minnesota.
Yeah. They were the bad boys of UHF, which is why Joel was originally offered the role of Farnsworth, the character in Weird Al's UHF.
Really?
Yeah. He was supposed to play the kooky inventor in that film, which totally suited. But Joel, for one reason or another, turned it down, and they got the male half of Luke and Laura from General Hospital to do it. And I gotta say, Luke rules in that part. He's really funny in that movie. He kind of walks away with it, although Joel would have been equally great, if not better.
Well, should we re-summarize this movie?
Hey, why not? That's what we're here for. And we watched KTMA Episode 4, Gamera versus Barugon. Ladies and gentlemen, it's the bout of the century! The heaviest of heavyweights is back. He's Japan's largest and ugliest creation outside of the Abino Harukas. The monster who puts the Dai in Daikaiju. The cause of all motion in the Pacific Ocean. No, it is not Godzilla. No, not Ghidra, the three-headed dragon. No, not Orochi, the eight-headed dragon. No, not Manda, the one-headed dragon. It's Gamera! Yes, with one M. What do you mean, never heard of him? He's a cross between a turtle and a Zippo. His special powers include fire breathing, flight, savage bites, and disappearing for large stretches of his own movie. Look, don't focus on the negative. Gamera is badass. As the narrator helpfully explains in the prologue, Gamera's brief time on Earth was so terrifying that the only solution was to mail him to Mars in a rocket ship. Yes, that was Military Plan Z. Z for Mars. Gamera returns to Earth to destroy a dam and absorb energy from it before going out for a smoke for the next 2 acts. Picking up the slack is the challenging lightweight kaiju, Barugon. Yes, Barugon, I'm not doing the list other monsters you think it might be bit again. He's a dog man with a freeze tongue, defensive rainbow beams, and, well, he's not much. The production team rolled a -6 for charisma when they were building his character sheet. Despite bottom billing for the title bout, Barugon's the closest thing this movie has to a central focus. Well, Barugon and jungle intrigue. Don't worry, though. Monster-loving kids will surely love the jungle adventure that takes center stage for the next half hour. Think of it as pre-fight entertainment. That part of the story begins with a bunch of grizzled men you'll never remember after this are discussing Opal. Surprisingly, they're not discussing Sid Barrett rarities, unlike every conversation about Opal I've held in a smoky room with a bunch of shifty guys. These shifties quickly hatch a plot to arrive in an exotic land and steal the treasured opal from the forbidden caves. There's betrayal, attempted murder, actual murder, and death by scorpion sting, and not in that order. Like most Forbidden Island treasures that come with a grave warning from the locals, the opal turns out to be an extremely dangerous egg. A Barugon egg, in fact. Karen, one of the island natives, heads to Japan after Barugon, and both these kids have a wild time in the big city. She by aiding the military in a counterstrike against Barugon, and Barugon by painting the town red, and green, and yellow, and blue, and purple, because Barugon shoots rainbows out of his back. Gamera, always chasing rainbows, arrives on the scene. Gamera and his opponent size each other up, but it's lights out for Titanic Turtle, as Barugon, the kaiju with the laughing face, uses his extendo tongue to freeze Gamera with pixie dust. If you placed your bets on Barugon winning the title bout, though, it must seem like smart money now. Luckily, Gamera thaws just in time for a rematch with Barugon, and the doofy, super-tongued dog beast is put to sleep, permanently. Anyone betting on Barugon lost their shirt, but who else would win this battle of the bulging suits? It's turtles all the way down as Gamera does his best impression of the CN Tower restaurant and swirls up to the skies. Will an even doofier monster come to challenge Gamera for the Kaiju Heavyweight title? Only time and the stability of the Japanese film industry will tell.
The host segment opens with Joel Hodgson immediately introducing the movie, Gamera versus Barugon.
You'll believe a giant mutated anatomically correct turtle can fly.
Joel tells his viewers to give him a call at 623-7655 and orders Cambot to put up a CG with Starfield of one of the messages. A so good compliment from a mom who watched it with her 2 kids. Aw. In segment 2, Joel is joined by Crow and Servo, not yet Tom Servo. And it's time for another message from viewers. Joel orders Helvetica Bold for this one. This guy loves the movies, but, quote, hated the constant interruptions. It was like being in a theater with a bunch of junior high teenagers. Brr. Joel and the bots then savage him. Sort of. And there's another recording demanding more, more, more. Servo and Crow, misunderstanding what more refers to, have an amusing back and forth. Segment 3 brings us a Gypsy, who is having wintergreen flavored chapstick applied to her lips. They play another message, this guy asking for more chapstick? This causes Gypsy to have a minor breakdown. What do you want from us? We're using all the chapstick we have. In segment 4, Joel and Crow have a tete-a-tete. Crow talks about his favorite lubricants and orifices. He likes noses and ears the best. Then, after an overload, Crow thinks, oh, perhaps the caller said more slapstick and not more chapstick? In the final segment, Crow and Servo are ordering 30 Domino's pizzas. Servo is sure they'll get the pizzas for free because there's no way they'll get there on time. And also they send some pizza to then Vice President-elect Dan Quayle.
All right, so this was our first experience with KTMA, and this is your first experience in life with KTMA, Beth.
Mm-hmm.
How was this? My stomach hurts.
First, maybe I will give some background for why I never bothered delving into KTMA before this. I'm going to read a passage from the Amazing Colossal Episode Guide, which has a pretty lovely summary of how Mystery Science Theater 3000 got started on KTMA and what those first early days looked like. But here I will summarize. I have no idea who wrote this either. We don't talk much about the early days anymore. Why, you ask again? Why don't we release these shows and cash in? Well, first, we don't dwell in the past. Second, the shows were seminal and formative, which is to say they weren't very good. Third, we've gotten a lot better. Fourth, technically, we don't have the legal right to release them. But beyond that, and fifth, there's a reason why musicians and artists leave a lot of work unreleased. And the typical reason is that it's not very good at all and you don't want it seen.
You know what? I kind of disagree. It's not, I have to say, like, the KTMA episodes are not perfect. Oh my God. And this is a really early one. This is, in fact, prior to the release of KTMA 1 and 2, which Joel released as part of the new season Kickstarter. This was the earliest one we had for a long time. And what's funny is that with the tapes that have been circulating by fans, you'll notice 2 things. One, the video quality of the recordings get better as time goes on of the episodes, so they're a little easier to watch. And 2, like, they actually get pretty good at the improvised and semi-improvised riffs that they're doing. Because for the first few episodes, they were only watching them, like, live. So you can actually hear Joel trying to cajole, no pun intended, Trace and Josh for riff topics. He's like, what do you think that monster's thinking right now? Like, they're trying to fill out the airtime. And I believe it's Josh in a tweet mentions it's a much later experiment, and I do believe a Gamera experiment, that they decided maybe we should watch these at least once before we do the show. And so you notice that KTMA actually, like, improves a lot by the time you get to the end of its run. And I remember when I was trying to watch the show in order, I could get through all of KTMA, but I stumbled and fell during season 1 and never looked back.
Like, I will say it was interesting from kind of archival perspective. For somebody who's interested in how this strange creation got made, it was interesting to see them try to figure out what formulas work, what don't. I was actually pretty impressed by the host segments. I thought they were pretty cute.
Yeah, same here.
And so that was a fun surprise. But it was interesting to see like what riffs look like when they're not planned. And I was most impressed. I thought Josh Weinstein, who is now J. Elvis Weinstein, he had the most riffs, I think. I thought he had the funniest ones, and he seemed to be the most consistent. In spite of the fact that I found his voice somewhat annoying, he was affecting a kind of semi-peewee voice that was a little bit much. I'm glad he dropped it later on.
It's funny. You can actually hear a bit of Kermit the Frog in it, and there's a moment where he starts singing Rainbow Connection.
Yeah.
As if to hammer home on this.
Why are there so sorry?
Now, this isn't Tom's first voice, I should also point out.
Really?
No, they tried a different one. I don't know if it's in the third episode because that's lost to time. But when KTMA02 was released, and again, we'll get into that when we get to that episode, but he's actually doing this kind of idiot voice. That's the best way I can describe it. He sounds like Bullwinkle with a head cold. He sounds like he's this close to saying like, "Here's your stick, Mr. Luthor," or "Gee, Shredder, I didn't count on the turtles showing up." Like he's doing almost a dumb henchman voice, and that got dropped really quickly. Not quite as quickly as Beeper did from the pilot, but quickly. And he did this for a couple more episodes, but somewhere during the run of Gameras that they did in KTMA, that Tom goes through robot puberty and gets just J. Elvis Weinstein's normal speaking voice.
Oh, interesting. And yeah, like I said, the host segments were pretty fun. They obviously were really a lot closer to audience participation back then.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting to see them build sketches on that participation. Like the chapstick one, I thought was the most clever because at first I was like, why is this guy asking about chapstick? Is this from like an earlier episode that they're just building on? And then it's not until the next segment that it explains, oh, did he actually say slapstick?
Yeah, it definitely doesn't sound like it though.
No, it doesn't.
I will say, I really like the host segments. That's one of the few times where the improvised feel of the show really shines. Because famously, they kind of conceived of a basic outline of what the sketches would be like the day of. And those would be kind of rushed out. And so they have this kind of fly by the seat of your pants quality that is really endearing. And it has still one of my favorite aspects of the Joel era of MST3K, which is flubbing a line and leaving it on air anyway.
And I also thought it was interesting that obviously, and it was something I always suspected, was that the formula that ended up being what we know so well wasn't quite there yet. Like it was still kind of like a monster movie host show, where you just host the show and come in during commercial breaks, kind of riff on what's happening, but it really is just a framework around the movie itself. And so I get the feeling that one of the reasons they didn't write any of the jokes is they didn't really want it to take over the entire program. Like it was still really movie focused at this point.
I think you're right, and I think that's one of the reasons why the KTMA theater is noticeably smaller than it is for the Comedy Central and Sci-Fi runs. Like through most of the show's run, it's a lot bigger and takes up more of the screen. And I also think that everybody making the show, like this is something that we kind of forget because MST3K is an institution and it's inspired so many things. Like I don't think there's a YouTube channel around that isn't influenced by MST3K. But in 1988, it didn't exist. And it had to be made. And you can see this a lot in the two episodes ahead of this one. Like they're picking up a bit of steam in this, their fourth episode in total, not counting the pilot, that they're trying to figure out when should they be silent and when should they be talking and riffing and playing with it? And what is the main focus here? Is the focus the movie or is the focus them? Like you really get a sense that this is evolving like right in front of you. And that's kind of what makes KTMA really exciting. And those first couple of KTMAs that got released really hard to watch because there's just long stretches of silence. Whereas here they're trying, like I said, Joel keeps probing for goofs. He's really trying to get the silences filled. And I found that the only part where they struggled is all the scenes with the military talking and strategizing.
Right.
They all three clearly lose interest at that point. This is Barugon and Gamera's picture, plain and simple. But that said, KTMA has something in particular that I think is worth praising, which is I think it actually has the best door sequence of any version of the show.
Yeah, I remember you mentioning that, so I made sure to look out for it. And it has a very bad kind of sound intro into it. So you'll be watching the movie and then there's just like a slight farting noise as the door sequence starts, but I thought the visuals were quite good.
Yeah, it's supposed to be a creaky vault, but it really does sound like grandma's last toot.
Oh, Jesus. Also, you get to see Cambot, or at least the creepy
scary
horror
Cambot?
version that was Cambot.
Nightmarish. How did you find that?
It was Lovecraftian. I'm glad that they modified that later on. But it was interesting to see how basically the models for the rest of the robots were there from the start. Obviously, they got a bit cuter and more puppet-like and more colorful. But I thought there was more playing around with robots before they finished on those final three. So I wasn't aware that they actually had Crow and Servo and Gypsy from pretty much the get-go.
Yeah. One of the things I like about this, because there's a really interesting thing about these early KTMA episodes, and that is, like, in particular, and that is that there's no Mads outside of the theme song.
I was wondering about that because they weren't in this, and so they're never in it.
They're in later. I'm not sure exactly. It might be like the 7th or 8th episode. Like they do show up, and they do show up within the first half of the show, or the first half of the season, I should say. But Joel, despite what it says in the theme song, Joel is the one who is seemingly in control. Like it looks like if you are to sort of figure things out together for yourself based on what you see in the show and still trying to make sense of the theme song, it looks like Joel was booted into space and given all of these movies as a kind of bad movie library as his only entertainment by the Mads, but is in no contact with them. And instead of this being recorded, because, of course, the paper-thin premise of the show has always been that Dr. F and assistant are recording the reactions, and the opening host segments are just the basic communication between scientists, or between scientist and test subject. Whereas here, it looks like Joel's able to talk to everybody at home in TV land. He's trapped in space. He only has movies, and he's bored. And he's made bots to keep himself company. And he's just going to watch whatever movie he finds. And which is a very different kind of vibe. And what I like and what I find kind of interesting. And I guess going with that, too, is with the premise that Joel's alone and making the most of a bad situation. The unique lyrics of this theme song has, Joel says, "When you make lemons, you make lemonade," which isn't in any other version of the song.
Such a classic Joel Hodgson concept.
Here, though the bots are rickety looking and primitive, especially compared to the like kind of streamlined and cutesy versions that we get and know and love from the rest of the show, I will say that these versions of the bots look convincingly like they were cobbled together by a man going out of his mind. So they work. Like Crow is unsettling because his eyes look like they're about to fall out of his head at any second. Tom Servo has weird Murphy Brown shoulder pads. And Gypsy is just terrifying as well. It's the voice, but it's the fact that she is also basically a metallic net with a flashlight.
I'll say one more thing that really that I was surprised by in KTMA is how little they talked about the movie beyond the initial introduction. Mm-hmm. Because that was something that I thought was fairly good about the one season episode we've forced ourselves to watch so far, is that they were doing a slight kind of analysis of the movie while they were watching it, and that was somewhat interesting. Whereas here, there's nothing. Like, they don't even talk about the fact that it's a giant turtle at any point.
Maybe they were aware that it's like, oh God, we've got 4 other ones of these to go. We got to save our turtle material. Right
now, it seems like the segments are mostly to promote the show, and try to get kind of a back and forth going on with the audience.
Yeah, they're really hitting home on the phone number so you can talk to Joel.
Talk to Joel.
Yeah, to the point where Joel actually thanks Cambot for putting it in the theater during one of the segments.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's fun, and it's like the whole thing is a different dynamic. So you get this kind of prototype of what the show is, but you also get like a different idea of what the show is too. And I find that like that's really interesting to watch. And how I watched these 2 episodes, to pull back the curtain a little bit, and how I recommended you do same, is to treat this basically like an early draft of the same material. And it was kind of interesting, watching them back to back, because I never did that with any of the KTMA episodes that got remade. Is that you'd actually sometimes hear the same jokes carry over that they decided were good enough. As at the beginning of both episodes, you hear one person, I believe it is Joel, actually it might be Joel both times, refers to Gamera's spinning body as a chicken pot pie.
Yes.
That's in both versions.
They liked that joke. They kept it.
Yeah, I was happy to hear that one too. And there's a few like that, but for the most part, it's like I was impressed that I would say the riffs in the Comedy Central episode, like 90% of them, maybe more, like maybe it's closer to like 98.9, are totally original. Like they're not in this episode anyway. Maybe future Gameras had spot on specific riffs that they decided to keep for other Comedy Central remakes, but not here.
And for people who are interested in the differences between the 2 Gameras across seasons, I'd also mention that they're edited very differently.
Mm-hmm.
So this one actually has a lot more Gamera, and it actually reflects the fact that when we're watching the Comedy Central versions, those movies are really heavily edited most of the time. So there's a significant Barugon and Gamera fight that is cut, and kind of the backstory of how Barugon gets the infrared radiation is also cut.
Yes, that's right.
Well, I will say that as much as I did not actually enjoy the experience of watching this movie, I was intrigued enough by the prehistoric version of Mystery Science Theater 3000 that I will not fight against watching another KTMA episode in the future.
Yay! Beth, this episode allowed us to actually sit and watch the movie, unlike Comedy Central, where during that time they're so polished that it's wall-to-wall jokes. So sitting down and watching Gamera versus Barugon, taste it again for the second time, would you actually want to sit and watch this movie? And secondly, do you think that kids would be interested in this movie?
No and no.
All right, wrap up the podcast. We're done.
I did not have that much fun watching this movie, mostly riffing free. There was, again, there's some kind of scholarly interest, because what I was studying was Victorian imperialism. It was interesting to see what seemed like a kind of imperialist story being used in a Japanese context. So, for instance, the idea of a whole bunch of Westerners going to like a primitive island and basically shocking everybody with their technology. That's a very Victorian, but ended up being a very American Hollywood idea that got used a lot.
Yeah.
But there was some interesting twists. Number one, the imperialists are bad, and the primitives are actually the smart ones who know what's going on. So that is an interesting flip over how that is usually situated. Usually you have a whole bunch of enlightened Westerners and a bunch of cannibals. So it was interesting to see what the Japanese did with that. The references to the war and the Pacific Theater were kind of interesting. The fact that the representative native Karen is quite prominent and intelligent, and men take her seriously, at least for a while, was refreshing and not expected. So there was a lot of twists to what I thought was going to be a formulaic choice. Also, the fact that it was a treasure hunt and then suddenly it's a kaiju movie. For those reasons, it was not completely boring, but as a source of entertainment, it was not there. The one thing I will say for it is it did not have an annoying kid, so it had that going for it.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because yes, this is, I think, the only 60s, 70s era Gamera movie to not have a kid. And this, it turns out, was not an accident. This was a very deliberate choice on behalf of Dai Studios and the producers of the film, since they decided to invest this particular movie with a much higher budget, and they wanted to go for a more mature tone, which is strange in a lot of ways, because it was at this time that the still successful Godzilla movies were marching towards a more child-friendly tone. And they decided to make this their big kind of A-list adult picture. Well, I shouldn't say adult picture because it's not like Gamera and Barugon are f***ing, but this was going to be something that was more, it was going to be like a little bleaker and a bit more like a real sci-fi story. Like this was something to be taken seriously. In fact, the guy who directed Gamera was demoted to focusing on the special effects rather than directing the movie. And interestingly, finding out some things about the original script, the natives, as you mentioned, all the native women were originally scripted to be topless.
Of course.
That was going to be, again, throwing their hat into the, I guess maybe I did mean the original intention of adult there, of throwing their hat in the ring of this being a proper and serious movie. But they they chickened out last minute. And there does seem to be some interference and some disagreement as to whether or not there should be interest for kids outside of just the giant monsters, as every now and then the movie threatens to do something slapsticky and weird, but cuts away from it. And the closest thing you get to, I think, child interest in this, because again, that's always going to be your biggest draw for giant monster movies, I think, are the monsters themselves and the fact that Barugon is so colorful and strange. I mean, he shoots rainbows out of his body, for God's sakes.
Yeah, and it's funny because you see, this isn't the only time you see what is ostensibly an adult movie or an adult franchise really hitting it with younger viewers. I mean, Terminator, for instance, is not meant for kids, but you yourself had bake-on flesh cyborg, didn't you?
That's right. I had a T I think it's the T100 or T800, I forget, but Arnold Schwarzenegger's Cyberdyne Systems robot. You could bake a little naked Arnold Schwarzenegger onto the robot skeleton, and the box proclaimed, "Rip his flesh off, you can do it," or something to that effect.
So there's something to be said about how even if you're trying to make a very serious adult movie, if it has certain themes and those themes are kind of fantastical or sci-fi, kids who are attracted to that kind of thing will probably end up being your viewers whether you like it or not.
Now, I find it interesting how these movies are promoted and whether or not they're going for a kid audience or not. And I want to share with you something. Beth, I want you to turn your attention to the It's Just a Show Slack.
All right.
Because what I'm going to share with you first is the Japanese poster for Gamera versus Barugon.
Okay.
There'll be a link in the show notes. It's delightful.
The longer I look on it, the better it gets.
Layers upon layers, yep.
In this lovely poster, Gamera is holding Barugon's tail between his teeth and his one hand. Okay, apparently he has opposable thumbs. And he's swinging him around like a bra he's just taken off.
Wah, wah, wah. Wah, 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 wah. My favorite part of this is it makes Gamera look very heroic, but also Barugon looks delighted to be there. Like they're a comedy team, like Mutt and Jeff.
And also in the very small bottom right corner, you have our two stars, Karen and Kazuki, kind of just having a little sweet moment, completely oblivious to their circus act they have behind them.
I know. If you look at the bottom corner where Kazuki and Karen are, it looks like they're saying, "I don't know if it's love, but I'll allow it." What they have is really special. Now, based on this poster, what are the impressions you get in terms of the audience that this is aimed at? Kids. Yeah. Even though this is a dry ass movie.
Like even they've even highlighted the fact that Barugon's spines create rainbows, and they've created like a beautiful kind of My Little Pony-esque rainbow on the back of them.
I gotta say, I really hope that one future Gamera movie sees the potential in Barugon being Gamera's like lovable sidekick. Because he's inherently lovable, I have to say. I don't think he's a great evil monster, but as a sidekick, he's pretty good.
Yeah.
Now, I want to turn your attention now to how Sandy Frank promoted this movie on video.
All right.
I think you'll find this will be uploaded to the Slack now.
Okay, now I have to bring in the My Little Pony again.
It's very My Little Pony.
The colors are very Lisa Frank. It's a lot of turquoise and purple, and Gamera and Barugon are hugging each other.
No, they're good pals.
And it actually says celebrity kids on the top. What the hell does that mean?
That was Sandy Frank's kid video label.
Oh my god. So okay, so he just marketed this directly to children in America.
Yes. And
those poor children.
In fact, one movie that I never rented of my own volition that was inexplicably in the horror section of my local Blockbuster Video was Gamera versus Guiron, which is actually my favorite of these 60s Gamera movies. But it has a very similar looking cover. And it has as the tagline, will Gamera survive Guiron, or will Guiron turn him into turtle soup? I thought, you're not selling me on this. I'm sorry.
I'm just going to read a little bit of the back, because the back blurb is pretty great. No town was big enough for the both of them. Gamera's back to challenge the new kid on the block. Oh, God.
Very topical reference.
A Godzilla lookalike contest loser with a bad attitude. Oh, and also on the front, challenging a Godzilla lookalike. He doesn't look like Godzilla.
No, neither of them really do.
No more Mr. Nice Turtle. This is so 80s.
I think you'll find that for a number of 80s releases of even like the more well-regarded Japanese monster movies had a, whoa, we're being hip and cool and ironic about these movies. Boy, they've got some real cheesy effects, am I right? Is in all of the copy, even from like bigger deal, like Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, which is generally seen as one of the high water marks of like kaiju movies, was released by Paramount on video. And it had just like the entire back of the VHS box is just whoever was doing the ad copy just ripping into the movie as if they were daring you to rent it. So that was not entirely uncommon. But I think it reflects the fact that it was eventually realized mostly by the guy who created these sorts of movies, because like Japanese special effects movies are considered or labeled tokusatsu, which means exactly that. It's going to be a fantastical special effects movie. And the guy who is more or less responsible for that is a fellow named Eiji Tsuburaya, who created Godzilla and created Ultraman and created most of the classic Godzilla monsters. And he realized about 4 movies in, around the time that Mothra vs. Godzilla came out, that kids love these movies and we should be putting more into the films to appeal to children. And the Gamera movies definitely followed suit, with this as the one glaring exception. And what I find interesting is that because this was the serious one, this was the attempt to make Gamera serious sci-fi in Japan. I think the only attempt at the time anyway. Mm-hmm. What's interesting is that they actually hired Eiji Tsuburaya to work essentially for his competitors to figure out how to do it, because being in a giant rubbery monster suit is terrible.
Yeah.
Like these things may be creatures of destruction, but every single one of them has a tiny crying man inside, as do we all. But on the original Gamera, they had a ton of trouble because sometimes an actor wouldn't even last a day in the Gamera suit.
Wow, really? Because it was so hot?
Yeah, it's nightmarish to be in these suits. Like even a small like latex creature it can be kind of awful. Like famously, Ted Raimi, when he played the possessed old hag Henrietta in Evil Dead 2, lost I think 10 pounds in a couple of days. And would peel off his feet, and there would be just pools of sweat coming out of it. And that's just when you're in something comparatively simple, as compared to like a Godzilla suit or a Gamera suit or Barugon, and having to be on all fours all day. Mm-hmm. And they hired Tsuburaya to essentially show them how it's done. Because do you want to guess how many actors played Godzilla in the 50s and 60s during kind of like the heyday of the series originally?
6?
1.
Oh.
Yeah. So because he took, it was a fellow named Haruo Nakajima, took such great pride in like suit acting and like being able to tough it out and also being able to perform and create a animalistic and strange movement for Godzilla. Like famously, he would tuck his arms in at the side so Godzilla had smaller arms and appeared more dinosaur-like, T-Rex-like. And they brought him on to kind of train actors to be able to handle the rigors of being in the suit, because Tsuburaya went from being Toho's #1 special effects craftsman to doing it for himself. He formed Tsuburaya Productions. He created a show called Ultra Q that became Ultraman, and he was making these miniatures and all these monster suits all the time. And so the two of them, him and his lead suit actor, Nakajima, basically got the Gamera people. They gave them essentially a crash course in how to make these movies and how to make it a little bit better for actors. Although Nakajima apparently would just put up with anything, because famously they had, in one movie they did, a bunch of explosives that went off directly under his groin. And he put up with that without complaint.
Oh my gosh. Well, I will say I especially felt sorry for the actor who's playing Barugon, because he has to do it on all fours. And
yeah,
like you can tell that he's trying not to just go on his knees all the time, because that's a very human kind of shape, but he just can't help it a lot of the time.
Yeah, I can imagine when the scene where the military fires his rainbow ray back to him via reflection, when he has to just turn over on his back, the actor must have been really relieved, if just for a moment. But because of this one guy, because of Tsuburaya, I think that's why we think of Japanese monster movies and Japanese special effects the way that we do. He famously, while he strove for realism in his miniatures, and that's something I'll always point out, is that like Godzilla miniatures tend to look a lot better than Gamera miniatures, generally speaking. But he didn't care for realism. He didn't think that made for a good or interesting creature or good or interesting special effects. And in the movie that introduces Barugon, the totally unrelated monster who has floppity ears and a scratchety tum-tum like a little puppy, the scene where he's introduced, he tramples a horse, and they could have matted in a horse, and that was the original plan. It was like, oh, we'll just put the horse in the miniature and we can blend that in and it'll look nice. And Tsuburaya insisted, it's like, no, I've got a horse puppet. It'll look great. You got to put this puppet in there. The finished film, the scene looks ridiculous. It looks like a plush toy that is filled with beans. It is a really goofy looking scene. And when asked about it by the director, who was horrified that the effect is deliberately goofy looking, asked, it's like, why did you do it this way? Can't we fix this? And he's like, no, it's funnier this way. And so that's kind of the approach these movies are taking. Like they're not trying to look real. And I think that's a mistake that a lot of Western audiences make.
Hey everybody, it's time for the Shallow 13.
All right, we're going to do Shallow 13 now. 13 quick facts about the movie and the episodes surrounding it. Adam, go!
The original dub of Gamera vs. Barugon was released by American International Pictures and was retitled War of the Monsters. Sandy Frank would release his uncut version with a different dub for the TV and home video markets in the 80s.
A lot of the characters' wives are wearing kimonos in this movie. Especially after World War II, Western-style clothes were increasingly worn in public, but at home, much more comfortable traditional clothing, mainly kimonos for both men and women, were worn.
According to the Gamera vs. Barugon DVD commentary, one of the prominent island dancers is Nanako Yamada. Yamada, a dancer who appeared in Akira Kurosawa's The Hidden Fortress and Ishiro Honda's Mothra, is still dancing today. She owns and operates the Yamada Nanako Modern Dance Studio in Tokyo.
The non-dubbed voice of Takuya Fujioka, who has a small role as a doctor in Gamera vs. Barugon, is in fact a pretty famous one. In Japan, Fujioka dubbed the voice of Mo in The Three Stooges and provided the voice of Donald Duck in Disney's Japanese dubs.
Why was the MacGuffin precious gem an opal? Because they kind of look like eggs, but they're not actually minerals because they don't have a crystalline structure. For that reason, their polished versions tend to be ovoid or egg-like.
Speaking of gems, the plan to lure Barugon into Lake Biwa involves a 5,000-carat diamond. That's a kilogram of diamond, or just over 2 American pounds. The largest diamond ever found, called Sergio, was 3,150 carats.
There's an awkward cut in the scene where the character servo-dubs Mr. Tea Leaves drops a banana peel on the floor, setting up a gag that never pays off. Apparently, a pratfall was shot and removed from the finished film, as producers felt Gamera movies needed a more mature tone and less chapstick. Later, even the setup for this moment was cut from the Comedy Central remake of this episode.
Joel and the bots frequently refer to Barugon as Lassie in this episode, which is ironic because Sandy Frank had his first distribution success with the Lassie series.
Another Sandy Frank success was You Asked For It, a show where audience members would send postcards explaining what they wanted to see on TV. The show was originally broadcast live, which led to one situation where a stuntman wrestling a huge anaconda started to go south, requiring an assistant to intercede with guns drawn.
Tom and Joel liken Gamera versus Barugon to westerns, albeit conflicting ones. When the two creatures size each other up, Tom declares high noon, which Joel follows by whistling Ennio Morricone's theme, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly.
The sketch, involving more and more misunderstandings of phrases with words more and for, includes several intensely Minneapolitan references, including WCCO Channel 4 newscaster Dave Moore and local jazz quintet More by Four.
Just as Joel got a new surname when the show went national, Best Brains, the studio behind MST3K, are also present here under a slightly different moniker, Hair Brain Productions.
Kevin Murphy is credited as a puppeteer despite Trace Beaulieu operating Crow, while Servo and Gypsy were handled by J. Elvis Weinstein. Presumably Murphy's credit is for Cambot, an in-joke referencing Murphy's gig as the show's camera operator.
And that's time!
And we were talking a bit about whether or not these monsters would be appealing viewing, and one distinctive thing about Barugon is his giant monster tongue, which is actually a fairly common trope.
The monster can destroy everything with its tongue. So as soon as my men get within its range, weapons are useless.
Well then,
It's just a tongue.
I mean, I wasn't grossed out. I was pretty neutral about it, but I was like, oh, somebody has seen a chameleon before, because it looks very chameleon-like, except for the fact that it blows ice out of the tip.
Yeah, we'll call it ice.
Was a little phallic.
Yeah, well, it's like that old episode of Star Trek, the original series, in which Spock spots a flower, and the flower shoots a bunch of flower jizz on him, and he turns into a hippie. A goddamn hippie.
But yeah, I have to admit, representations of tongues are not my favorite.
Why is that?
I don't know. I would say it's because tongues are lolly.
What does that mean?
You know, they kind of lull.
Oh.
That is the best verb I can think about to describe what they do. They just kind of lull around and are wet.
So you side with Crow in our previous episode we looked at on Comedy Central, where he's just weirded out by human tongues just sitting around in your mouth all day.
Yeah. Although apparently most of the time they're actually they're touching the tip of your palate. That's where they're supposed to be. I know this because mine wasn't, and that's why I needed braces.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
No.
Not really. I had a crowded mouth, and then there was nowhere for the tongue to sit properly. This sounds so gross. God damn it.
Keep it in its gold. Tongue gold.
Even the word is awful.
Tongue. I like that. Although, again, it makes it sound like, I mean, the word tongue is fitting for Barugon because it sounds like something that would be with an extremely doofy looking monster.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like the use of tongue in movies to suggest something otherworldly or threatening or sexual or all of the above is not at all uncommon. I guess one of the more famous examples would be, bookending the Nightmare on Elm Street series. There are several movies in which a tongue is used very prominently, and it got referenced in Mystery Science Theater 3000 a bunch, because there's a famous line in the first movie where Johnny Depp, who is the boyfriend of our lead character, is sucked into a bed, and the bed turns into a blood volcano because he's real dead. And Nancy, the lead character, gets a phone call from Freddy Krueger where during a dream, and he says, "I'm your boyfriend now, Nancy," and the tongue suddenly sports a human mouth on the receiver and starts licking her face. Yeah. And that has been referenced a number of times, including the previous episodes, the 304 Gamera versus Barugon. But like, it was prominent in It Conquered the World as well. I think Trace Beaulieu actually did the same riff twice whenever that bat creature showed up.
It must have been a striking moment in that movie.
It's unforgettable. And it seemed to be one of Freddy Krueger's main things, as there is in the third movie, Dream Warriors, what's many consider to be the highlight of the series. Freddy Krueger ties a kid up by throwing up tongues, and they bandage him up on a bedpost while he does his filthy business. And then in Wes Craven's New Nightmare, which more or less wraps up the series, Freddy Krueger shoots a giant tongue out of his mouth and wraps somebody up with it to the point that they're blindfolded and bound, and they are kind of the victim in question is struggling to keep the tongue in place as though it were a writhing snake, and later bisects the tip of it. Tongue stuff. It's in Wes Craven's forte.
I really can't think of anything else that features tongues prominently, and I thank Hollywood for that.
What about Alien?
Oh.
He's got a monster tongue. He's basically Barugon.
I didn't even think of that as a tongue. I thought of it as a little alien.
A little buddy.
Little buddy. Little buddy wants to say hi too.
Yeah, Say Hello to My Little Friend was cut from the original script of Alien. They later redid it in Scarface. Yeah, it becomes kind of a prominent thing because there is, like, tongues are often used in, like, horror movies where, you know, you are often blending a mix of the sexual and the creepy. Like, there's a really famous shot in the American version, the surprisingly good American version of The Grudge, in which a character returns home after a long disappearance from visiting the Grudge house and turns around to reveal that her jaw has been ripped clean off and her tongue just spills out of her head before the camera cuts away. But on the campier side of things, Tongue Fever inspired a bizarre little movie called Killer Tongue that was made. It's a Spanish horror movie that I confess I've only seen in bits and pieces late night on TV. But it does exactly what it says on the tin. It's about a woman with a superpowered tongue who uses it to murder people.
Okay, I am thinking of one tongue moment, but it's in Beetlejuice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When the main characters whose names I forget, but they're played by Alec Baldwin and Gina Davis, decide to scare themselves up, so they stretch out their faces, and I think it's Gina Davis's character who knocks her eyes into the back of their head and opens up her mouth so that her eyes are now above her tongue, so she has kind of a little tongue face inside her face. That was pretty creepy.
Yes.
And that's a good movie. I don't think it needs my help, but hey, Beetlejuice is a good movie.
But hey, speaking of tongues, let's get into the dub of this movie.
Was it Sandy Frank who took care of that?
Yes. So this is the Sandy Frank dub. The original dub was done by American International Pictures, which also distributed a lot of the OG Gamera movies for TV in the 60s and 70s.
And are legendarily bad at dubs.
Well, here's the thing. The Sandy Frank dubs are notoriously awful.
Mm-hmm.
And with good reason. A lot of people sound very Minnesotan, especially when we get to the series Triumph, Gamera versus Guiron. But the American International Picture dubs for these movies are actually really good.
Oh, really? That's a surprise.
Yeah. AIP released a ton of kaiju movies, and with, sad to say, lesser tier monsters like Gamera, who just did not have that theatrical viability, they would distribute those to television. Gamera vs. Barugon debuted on American TV instead of theaters as War of the Monsters with an AIP dub. And AIP released a lot of Godzilla movies of the 60s in theaters, and the people they always hired was a studio called Tetra. And Tetra, which I believe has now been renamed Titan Studios, and I think they're still active today in dubbing, or at least they had been for a while. Their original claim to fame is that they're the ones responsible for dubbing the original Speed Racer. So, yeah, that kind of motor-mouthed delivery,
right?
That's something that they originated, and that's something that they specifically originated for not only syncing up with the Japanese movements so that the characters could match what they were saying on screen. Like the voice actors could match the characters. But they kind of had to do the same thing when coming up with a dub script for these live action movies.
Mm-hmm.
And this is kind of a quaint thing now, but it was done out of respect, believe it or not, is a lot of the characters are deliberately meant to sound Japanese, and they're rationing behind it. So you have, New York actors where, Teacher was situated in New York, doing what they dubbed the haccent, which was trying to sound as though you were Japanese. You were doing your best impression of that. So they were pitching themselves up a little bit higher in terms of their speaking voices, and they were dropping R's.
Oh, interesting.
And this was done, believe it or not, it was not done to mock or make fun of the Japanese, but because they thought that if American audiences see Japanese faces with New York accents, they're going to be taken out of this movie. They're not going to take it seriously at all. And if they hear what they think a Japanese person sounds like coming out of a Japanese actor, it'll sell the movie better.
It's interesting. It's an interesting theory.
Yeah, it's interesting to reflect on that as times have definitely changed. We're at a point now where I believe, have they made it official now that Apu is no longer going to be on The Simpsons?
I've deliberately not followed that show for a very long time.
Same here.
Why won't they just let it die? Why won't they let its shambling corpse die?
I know. I was really hoping that after about 8 seasons, The Simpsons would be relegated to holiday specials.
Yeah. Just do the Halloween ones. That's fine.
Yeah, that's all anybody likes. All right, so be that as it may. There's been a change of attitude, and I sometimes find the more modern attitude to be like a little more condescending. It's like, yes, you wouldn't hire white actors to dub Japanese characters necessarily, but it also seems, and you definitely wouldn't encourage them to do an accent based on what they think a Japanese person would sound like. That having been said, it's like part of this is nostalgia because I did grow up with some of these dubs. I find them, because they're so full of character, and the comedy that's derived is always derived from what's going on screen instead of an ethnic stereotype. But you wouldn't have that done anymore. However, I remember in more recent dubs, studios would always proudly proclaim, we've hired nothing but Asian actors for these roles. And it's kind of interesting because you're sort of implying that then you're kind of reinforcing the same thing. It's like, oh, Japanese people have a sound regardless of where they're from.
Mm-hmm.
And some studios, like Sony, when they dubbed Godzilla 2000 for a theatrical release, again, with the best of intentions, were also boasting about how they hired many Chinese actors so the movie would sound more authentic. And Godzilla's not a Chinese thing.
Whoops.
Yeah.
I mean, it's great that more Asian actors are getting work because it's hard to do that, but it is a weird kind of typecasting, isn't it?
Yeah. And although, funnily enough, like, even though a lot of the actors in these dubbing studios doing the looping were white, not all of them were. Like, famously, Key Luke, who is an actor in a ton of things, and is, depending on whether it's you or your grandpa, you'll know him from either Charlie Chan, where he was that character, or the wise old shop owner from Gremlins.
Oh.
And Gremlins 2, The New Batch. Key Luke did dubbing on some of these Japanese monster movies. Not necessarily with Tetra, but he was one of the actors they got. Another one who you can hear in Rodan, and I think the very first Godzilla sequel, is George Takei.
Huh.
Yeah. They ran into a problem in one of the Japanese monster movies where they couldn't figure out what could possibly sync up with the actor's lips when he's in a moment of panic. And what they do for that scene is they just had George Takei say banana oil because that's the only thing that matched. Yeah. It turns out that is an old-timey phrase, but banana oil doesn't really make sense in the scene.
Banana oil!
So we have looked at Gamera versus Barugon twice over, and we've just, I think, finished our little talk on KTMA episode 4. Chris, checking our mailbag, did we get, by any chance, a random question from a listener?
Let's turn that question right back around. And I want to know, if you could call 623-7655 and speak to Joel in 1988, What would you guys say to him?
Whoa, sexy single Joels are waiting for our call, Beth.
I was going to say something snarky, like advising him to script his riffs.
Zing.
But in rereading the Amazing Colossal episode guide, they were very poorly paid. They actually say that Trace got maybe $25 a week. So it was not worth their time to script the movie.
No.
And it was actually probably a kismet that they only learned that was a good idea once they came to a better paid position with Comedy Central. So instead, maybe I'd ask him to just dish on Gallagher for a bit.
Joel, now that you are in outer space, please tell us all that you want to tell us about Gallagher.
How bad is he?
As it turns out, really bad. We'll get into that in a later episode. I think what I would do, because really, I am a time traveler in this scenario, because I'd be calling Joel now using my future to past phone. So I would leave a very cryptic message that would be the phone number of the person's charge of the comedy channel way back in the 1980s. Get that ball rolling. And who knows, maybe this already happened. Also, I broke my glasses and now I can't read books anymore. So many twists.
If you've been affected by the issues on this show, if you are standing in a latex suit in pools of your own sweat, or if you'd like to write Beth and Adam, get in touch with us. Our website is itsjustashow.com, or we're on Twitter at itisjustashow. We'd love to hear from you. It's Just a Show is a podcast from Megaphonic FM. Find all our fancy little shows at megaphonic.fm. Thanks again to all our Patreon supporters. You guys are great, and you help keep us going. Support It's Just a Show and access some superfan Gamera bonus bits by going to itsjustashow.com/Patreon or patreon.com/itsjustashow. And if you want to follow up on anything that was mentioned today on It's Just a Show, you'll find links in our show notes at itsjustashow.com/episode/21.
I suppose that means that Gamuary is over.
Oh, thank God. That's enough kaiju chaos for a little while.
I'd take down, the giant plastic globe decoration that is resting on Gamera's back in celebrating this most sacred time of year. I've got to throw away my Barugon stocking, which was once full of candy. And now we have to face something fresh, new, and uncharted on this show.
Yes, Chris, what are we going to be watching next?
Well, a little Gamuary poem for you. G is for the giant turtle in my heart.
No, stop!
Who needs to spin off to outer space now and leave you until next year, or the next giant monster attack. Let's go back to regular-sized monsters with Season 8, Episode 1, Revenge of the Creature.
Ooh.
The first sci-fi episode?
The very first. This will be interesting, because this is famously what put you off of the era. And I actually remember getting at least this episode in early tape trading and thinking the show was in decent hands, and kind of changed my mind a little bit later on. But hey, I love Gilman. He's my favorite of the Universal monsters.
Oh, fun. Okay. Well, yes, I do recall. I don't know if this was the first one I saw. I think it wasn't, but it wasn't anything about the quality that turned me off so much as I just really hated Crow's new voice. But I think I've gotten over that.
Not to mention, I think you're going to fall in love with a little fella by the name of Gilman. I think you'll find that he's the closest thing the Universal Monsters has to an MRA group, because he's all about kidnapping ladies and being misunderstood.
Isn't this what Guillermo del Toro is doing on his new movie?
Yes. He is one of several directors who really, really wanted to make a new Gilman movie.
Oh, well, maybe that'll come up in the next episode.
Fingers crossed.
All right. Well, then, on that note,
somewhere over the rainbow, missiles are destroyed. Rear view mirrors will reflect back and hurt the monster that created it.
Well, that penetrated again my hard turtle exterior. So again, I'm touched, but I must bid you all farewell until Gilman shows up. Bye-bye, everybody.
Goodbye.
take it away, Theme Squad.